The name tag on her chest said, maintenance, but her hands remembered things that name tags never could. Tessa Vaillancourt had been working the overnight shift at St. Margaret Community Health Center for 11 months when the storm hit. Not the ice storm. That came later. The one she was already living through was quieter. The kind that settles into the bones of a person who has seen too much and chosen, deliberately, to become invisible. She liked it that way. The health center sat at the edge of a small town, 2 hours north of Montreal. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's vehicle, and the Tim Hortons closed at 9. St. Marguerite wasn't big enough for a real hospital. It had 18 beds, 2 examination rooms, a tiny surgical suite used mostly for minor procedures, and a staff that rotated through with the confidence of people who rarely faced anything they couldn't handle with a phone call to the regional hospital in Rouen-Noranda. Tessa fixed things: boilers, ventilation units, backed up floor drains in the supply room. She arrived at 6 in the evening and left at 6 in the morning, and in between she kept the building breathing. She ate her lunch alone in the utility corridor, sitting on a 5-gallon bucket with a thermos of black coffee and a paperback she never quite finished. The night staff knew her name. The day staff mostly didn't bother. That suited her fine. What the staff at St. Margaret did not know, what Tessa had taken considerable care to ensure no one would know, was that she had spent 8 years with the Canadian Forces Medical Service, that she had done 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medical technician with the 2nd Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment, that she had held pressure on wounds in condition that would make the calmest emergency physician in this building go very still and very quiet, that she had a scar along her left forearm from a night in Kandahar she did not talk about, and a prescription for the dreams that followed her home from it. She had left the forces at 31. She was 34 now. The gap in between was a story she told no one. The evening of the storm began like any other. She signed in at the maintenance desk, checked the work order log, and headed down to look at a heating unit on the east wing that had been cycling irregularly for 3 days. The temperature outside was dropping fast. February in northern Quebec had a particular cruelty to it, and she wanted the unit running steady before midnight. She was halfway through the diagnostic when she heard the ambulance. One ambulance wasn't unusual, but the radio chatter she caught through the hallway speaker clipped fast. The particular cadence of paramedics who were pushing made her pause with her hand on the panel casing and listen without meaning to. Adult male, mid-50s, construction accident on the highway bypass, crush injury to the lower left leg, significant blood loss, BP dropping, ETA 4 minutes. She went back to the heating unit. It wasn't her business. The problem was, she heard everything from that corridor. The intake bay was 30 feet away, and the walls in St. Margaret were not thick. She heard the gurney wheels, heard the paramedics' handoff, heard Dr. Fontaine, the attending on call, a compact man in his late 40s who wore his confidence like a second lab coat, take the report in the brisk, slightly bored tone he used for cases he had already mentally categorized. She heard him say, "Let's get him stabilized and arrange transport." She heard one of the paramedics, a young woman named Boudreau, who worked the northern corridor, say, "His pressure's been unstable the whole ride, doctor. I'd feel better if someone looked at the leg before we move him again." She heard Fontaine say, "I'll be the judge of that." Tessa turned back to the heating panel. Alert. 40 minutes later, she was in the supply room replacing a section of pipe insulation when a second call came in. She heard it differently this time. not through a speaker but through the walls themselves. A sudden sharpening of voices, feet moving faster than they had been. She set down her pipe wrap and stood still, hurt. Her head tilted the way she had trained herself out of doing, because people noticed and asked questions. The patient from the highway was crashing. She walked to the doorway of the supply room, which looked out onto the east corridor, and watched Fontaine stride past with two nurses, one of whom was already pulling a crash cart. She recognized the nurse in front, Chantal, mid-30s, 8 years on the ward, steady hands and a calm that didn't crack under pressure. Chantal was not calm right now. Tessa walked to the end of the corridor and looked through the window in the bay door. The man on the table was gray. Not pale, gray, the specific color of someone whose body was making decisions about where to send what little blood remained. His left leg, what she could see of it below a pressure dressing that was already soaked through, was wrong in a way that went beyond a break. The crush had damaged something deeper. She could see it in the angle, in the swelling that had started moving up toward the knee, in the way his foot sat. Fontaine was on the phone. She could hear fragments. "We need a surgical team on standby." "Yes, I know it's late. The road conditions." He turned away and his voice dropped. Chantal was rechecking the IV line, her face doing the thing faces do when the hands are busy, but the mind is somewhere else, somewhere frightened. The man on the table opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. He didn't look like a man who expected to see the morning. Tessa pushed through the bay door. "His dressing needs to come off," she said. "The bleeding is internal now. You're losing him from the inside." Fontaine turned. He looked at her the way people look at something that has appeared in a room it has no business being in. "Who are you?" "Maintenance. The pressure wrap is compressing the vessels, but the damage is proximal. The crush site is higher than it looks. You need to see above the knee." Fontaine stared at her for a moment, with an expression that moved through several stages quickly. Surprise, irritation, the particular kind of dismissal that does not need to be spoken aloud to be perfectly clear. "I need you to leave this area." "I understand. I'm asking you to check above the knee first." "Security." He looked around. There was no security at this hour. St. Margaret had a buzzer system and a lock on the front door. "Dr. Fontaine." Chantal's voice came quietly from the other side of the table. His pressure just dropped again. Fontaine moved back to the table. He did not look at Tessa again. She understood that as her dismissal, and she took it. Stepping back through the bay door into the corridor, standing with her back against the wall and her arms at her sides and her heart doing something she didn't have a word for in either of her languages. She had been wrong before. She could be wrong now. Fontaine had training she didn't, equipment she couldn't read from a doorway, a clinical picture she'd assessed in 30 seconds through a window. She stood in the corridor and told herself these things for 4 minutes. Then the monitor alarm went off. She was through the door before she decided to be. What happened in the next several minutes was not something Tessa could have described afterward in any orderly way. It was not orderly. It was the controlled version of chaos she had learned. In another country, in another life, in the back of vehicles, and on the floors of buildings that were never designed to save anyone. Her hands found the dressing. Her hands found the sight. She called for what she needed in the flat, efficient voice she hadn't used in 3 years. The one that came from a place before she was a person trying to be invisible. And the nurses. Chantal first, then the younger one whose name she didn't know, handed her things, because when a voice sounds like that in a crisis, you move before you think about why. Fontaine stood at the edge of the room. She was aware of him the way she was aware of the monitor, the IV stand, the light above the table, peripherally as part of the environment she was working inside of. She did not have bandwidth for anything that was not the man in front of her. The vessel was where she'd suspected. Higher, deeper, the crush damage had migrated up, and the original dressing had been holding pressure in the wrong place, slowing the visible bleed while the hidden one continued. She packed it correctly. She called the pressure, called for the line to be adjusted, and when the monitor tone shifted, when it moved from the flat urgency of alarm into something slower and more rhythmic, she stayed where she was and kept her hands where they were and did not move until she was certain the rhythm would hold. Then she stepped back. The room was very quiet for a moment. Chantal was looking at her. The younger nurse was looking at her. The man on the table was breathing in a way that was no longer the breathing of a man deciding whether to stay. Fontaine hadn't moved from the edge of the room. "He'll need surgical transport," Tessa said, "but he's stable enough to move now. The road conditions are going to be the bigger problem." Nobody said anything. She picked up the soiled dressing from the floor because that was the kind of thing she noticed, the kind of small order she imposed on chaotic spaces without thinking about it. She dropped it in the biohazard bin. She pulled off her gloves. "I'll go check on that heating unit," she said. She was almost at the door when Fontaine said, "Wait." She stopped. She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized. She had seen it on the faces of officers when they realized they had misread something, when the situation had revealed itself to be something other than what they'd filed it as. It was not a comfortable expression to wear or to witness. "Who are you?" he said again, but he meant something different this time. She considered the question. "Tessa Vaillancourt," she said. "I maintain your HVAC system and your East Wing plumbing." "That's not." He stopped. He tried again. "That's not what I meant." "I know." She put her hand on the door. "Medic, 2 RCR, 2 tours." She paused. "I'm not that person anymore. I'm just the person who was here." She went back to the East Wing. Burnt. The heating unit had stopped cycling irregularly. She wasn't sure when that had happened. She sat down on the floor next to it with her back against the wall, and her knees pulled up, and her hands, which had stopped shaking at some point she couldn't identify, flat on her thighs. Burnt. She had not meant for any of that to happen. Well, she sat there for a long time. The ice storm arrived around 2 in the morning. She heard it first as a change in the wind against the windows, then as a series of sounds from outside that meant ice accumulating on surfaces that were not designed to hold weight. She got up and did a circuit of the building, checking the roof drainage points, the emergency exits, the backup generator connection. Work. The kind of work that kept her present and out of the past. She was checking the south exit when Chantal found her. The nurse was still in scrubs, still wearing the slightly hollowed look of someone who had been through a shift that had not gone the way any shift was supposed to go. She was holding 2 coffees from the break room machine, the kind that came out of a nozzle and tasted like hot brown water with ambitions, and she held one out to Tessa without preamble. Tessa took it. They stood together at the south exit, looking out at the ice building on the parking lot. Neither of them said anything for a while. "He's going to make it," Chantal said eventually. "They got the road cleared enough for the transport. They called from the highway. He's holding." Tessa nodded. "How did you know?" Chantal asked, not accusatory, genuinely asking. Tessa looked at her coffee cup. The color of the dressing, The way his foot was sitting, I've seen that pattern before. In the forces? She nodded again. Why did you? Chantal stopped herself, rephrased. You didn't have to come back in. No, but you did. Tessa thought about this. She thought about the man on the table looking at the ceiling with the eyes of someone who has done the calculation and found the numbers coming up short. She thought about a different ceiling in a different country and a different set of hands that had reached for her when her numbers were coming up short, and what it had meant that those hands were there. I've been on the other side of that table, she said. I know what it looks like when someone walks away. Chantal was quiet for a moment. Outside, the ice ticked against the glass. Fontaine wants to talk to you, she said. When you have a minute, she chose her words. He's not great at saying things out loud, but he wants to talk to you. Tessa thought about that. Tell him I'll be around, she said. I've got a boiler check at 4. Chantal almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but it was close. She left Tessa alone at the south exit with her terrible coffee and the sound of ice on glass and the slow, particular quiet that comes after a crisis has passed and the building is still standing, and the person you weren't sure would make it through the night is in a vehicle heading south toward people with better equipment and more resources, and the particular luxury of never having had to figure out how to work with less. Tessa finished the coffee. She crumpled the cup. She went to check on the boiler. The ice storm knocked out power to the north half of the building at 3:47. She had the backup generator running in 6 minutes. She knew every switch, every relay, every point of failure in that system, the way she had once known the layout of a forward operating base. Not because she had memorized it, but because she had paid attention. Every day, in the way that people pay attention when they understand that the systems keeping other people alive depend on no one dropping the thread. She was resetting the panel when Fontaine appeared in the generator room doorway. He was still in his lab coat. He looked like a man who had been sitting with something uncomfortable for several hours and had finally decided the discomfort of sitting with it was worse than the discomfort of addressing it. He said, I owe you an apology. She kept her eyes on the panel. You don't know me. No, I don't. He came into the room, stopped a few feet away. I dismissed what you were telling me. I made an assumption about what you knew and what you were qualified to say, and I was wrong. And that assumption, he stopped, started again. That assumption almost cost that man his life. She turned to look at him then. He was not a man she would have liked, she thought, in another context. The confidence was still there, the structure of it, the habit of authority. But underneath it, right now, was something she recognized. Not guilt, exactly, not quite, but the specific discomfort of a person who has discovered that the map they were using does not match the territory. You couldn't have known, she said. I look like the maintenance woman. That's not. I know, she said. That's not the point. She turned back to the panel, reset the last relay. The point is you know now. And next time someone you don't recognize tells you something about your patient, you'll take 30 seconds to check before you dismiss it. He was quiet. That's all I wanted, she said. That's all I came in to say. Hurt. She closed the panel cover. The generator hummed steadily. Outside, the ice storm was doing what ice storms do, rewriting the surfaces of everything, making the familiar unrecognizable, leaving behind a world that would look completely different in the morning light. Fontaine said, I'd like to know more about your background, if you're willing to talk about it. I'm not, she said, not unkindly, but I appreciate you asking. He nodded. He left. Aren't. She stood alone in the generator room and listened to the hum of the machine she had just fixed and thought about the man on a transport heading south and the woman she had been and the woman she was now, and whether those were the same person or two different people sharing a body and a past. She thought about this for a while. She didn't arrive at any conclusion, but that was fine. She had learned, over 3 years of quiet overnight shifts and paperback novels she never finished, and coffee that was never as good as the coffee she used to make, on a camp stove in the gray light before a day that could go any number of ways. She had learned that most of the important questions didn't arrive at conclusions. They just lived with you, and you carried them. And sometimes they were heavy, and sometimes they were just part of the weight of being a person who had been through things. The shift ended at 6. She signed out at the maintenance desk, returned her radio to its cradle, picked up her jacket and her bag. Chantal was finishing her own notes at the nursing station and looked up when Tessa passed. "Roads are bad," Chantal said. "The 117 is a sheet of glass, apparently. I'll take the back way." "You sure?" "I know the roads." She paused. "Any update from the transport?" Chantal checked her phone. "He's in surgery. They're saying good prognosis." Tessa nodded. She put on her jacket. "Tessa." She stopped. Chantal was looking at her with an expression that was trying to say several things at once and doing the best it could with them. "Thank you," she said, "for coming back in." Tessa looked at her for a moment. The fluorescent lights of the nursing station hummed overhead. Somewhere in the building, the heating unit she'd fixed the night before was cycling smoothly, quietly, doing exactly what it was supposed to do without anyone noticing. "That's the job," she said. She pushed through the front door and out into the ice-covered morning. The parking lot was a mirror. The trees were wrapped in glass. The sun was just coming up behind the tree line to the east, hitting all of that ice at a low angle, and for a moment the world looked like something extraordinary, cold and hard-won and lit from within, the way things look when they've survived the night and are still, improbably, standing. She pulled her keys from her pocket. She drove home the back way because she knew the roads. I keep thinking about what Tessa said when Chantal thanked her. That's the job. Not I'm a hero, not I couldn't just stand there. Just that's the job, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Aren't. I've been sitting with that for a while now. There's something I've noticed about people who have genuinely been through hard things. They don't announce themselves. They don't need you to understand what they've carried or where they've been. They just show up. They read the situation clearly, and they do what needs doing. Tessa walked back through that bay door, not because she wanted to be seen, but because she had already seen what happened when people with knowledge stayed quiet to keep the peace. She'd been on the other side of that table. She knew. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing, actually. What happened in that health center that night was a direct consequence of choices. Every single one of them. Fontaine chose to dismiss a voice he didn't recognize, and a man nearly died for it. Tessa chose to speak up anyway, and then chose to come back when it mattered most, and that man made it to surgery. Boudreau chose to push back gently in the intake bay, which planted a seed even if nobody acknowledged it in the moment. Chantal chose to hand Tessa what she needed without asking for credentials first, because she read the situation with clear eyes and trusted what she saw. Every action had a consequence. Every silence did too. I think about Tessa's hands. 8 years of training, 2 tours, a scar she doesn't explain, and then 3 years of trying to become someone who just fixes boilers. That choice came from a real place. I don't think she was hiding from herself, exactly. I think she was trying to figure out who she was outside of the context that had shaped her. That's a deeply honest thing to need. There's real integrity in knowing you have to step back from something in order to understand it. But the knowledge didn't leave. The judgment didn't leave. When she looked through that window and read that patient's color and the angle of his foot, she wasn't performing expertise. She was just seeing clearly, the way you see clearly when you've spent years training your eyes to notice what other people have learned to look past. That clarity is something you build. It doesn't arrive. It comes from paying attention every day in conditions that make it hard to pay attention. It comes from caring enough about the outcome to stay sharp, even when no one is watching, even when the stakes feel low, even when you're alone in a utility corridor at 3 a.m. with a thermos of coffee and a book you never finish. And then when the moment comes, and it always comes, you're ready. Not because you're exceptional, because you were honest about what you knew, and you stayed with it, and you didn't look away. That's what I took from Tessa Vaillancourt's story. The quiet ones aren't quiet because they have nothing to say. Sometimes they're quiet because they've already said everything that matters through the way they live, the way they show up, the way they go back through the door when every reasonable instinct says they've already done enough. She drove home the back way because she knew the roads. I think about that a lot.